My name is Chisom Udeze. I am an economist and also diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. And I am the executive director at Diversify, the nonprofit behind this initiative. Really good to have you here with us. I'm going to describe my background and myself. I am a Black woman. I have brown skin. My hair today is pulled in a ponytail. I am wearing pearl earrings, a yellow sweater, and my background is blurred. But on the right-hand side is this kind of like African print fan that we have in West African countries. I like to put pops of color on my wall to make it interesting. And on the left-hand side, you might see makings of also woven baskets that I've also hung up on the wall. Got them from Rwanda, I believe. So yeah, my pronouns are she, her. Really happy to be here. So I'm going to move on to Sarah.
Hiya, I'm Sarah. My pronouns are she and her. I work also for a nonprofit called Stonewall. We're located in London, but we work across the world. We're an LGBTQ plus rights charity, and we work in a whole bunch of areas. But as head of programs there, I work a lot with workplaces. I provide kind of consultancy, training, and support to help people understand how to make their workplaces more LGBTQ plus inclusive. A little bit of description of myself. I have brown, straight hair that is tied up behind my head. I'm wearing a headset with a microphone, brown glasses. I'm white. I have green eyes, and I'm wearing a sort of brownish coloured sweater vest. My background is blurred because it's a bit messy, but you'll see like a bit of a plant above my head. There's a chair behind me, and then there's the door through to my kitchen behind me as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Charlie.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlie Fonda. My pronouns are they, them. I am currently a student at the University of Oslo. That's where I'm joining from today as well. I am studying a master's degree in the theory and practice of human rights, and human rights is mostly what I dedicate my life to. Description of myself. I am a white genderqueer person with black curly hair, short hair. I'm wearing glasses and a brown sweater today. In my background, on my right side, I have a little map of region of Norway and a poster that says Free Palestine. And on my left, I have a tapestry from a market from my hometown in Italy with the blue fishes on it. I'm 23-year-old, so Gen Z, I guess, for the sake of this panel.
Thanks, Charlie. Happy to have you with us. Okay, so we're just going to jump right in. I think we want to jump right to assumptions. So I want to ask Charlie, Sarah, and I'll share where relevant. What is the common assumption about, your generation that you believe is either completely inaccurate, especially when it comes to work, values, or identity? Sarah, let's go first with you.
So I asked about this and I got told that millennials are not very cool, and I am slightly upset about that. But I don't know, take that one or leave it. I think one of the more difficult assumptions that I find is I think my generation, I am a millennial, we grew up we've kind of got to adulthood in quite a financially unstable, politically unstable time in the world. And I think there's an assumption that everyone has 17 side hustles and wants to work 24 hours a day and pour everything kind of into their career and constantly be working and constantly be kind of hustling to make more money. And I think that that is a tricky one, right? Because I think sometimes that's a product of circumstance, sometimes that's a product of individuality. And I think, as with any assumptions that describe a huge group of people, it's always going to be a really reductive way of thinking and looking at what is a complex and kind of multifaceted experience of a generation.
Thanks for sharing. Charlie.
Yeah, where to start? I think there is a lot of assumptions and stereotypes about Gen Z, especially now as we are approaching, like starting our jobs and like entering the workplaces. I think one of them is probably that we're very easily offended by things that are happening in the offices. But I like to counter that by saying that I actually feel that older generations are the ones that are more easily offended when, for instance, young employees demand basic labor rights. And I think that's very linked as well with another assumption that Gen Z are generally lazy and expect too much from workplaces even before starting working there. And I think that's quite inaccurate. I mean, I'm not the only person that thinks that. There has been a lot of articles written on this already. But I think it's simply because we are done with exploitative labor and demand fair and equal wages. And also, I think older generations tend to forget that Gen Zers face tougher financial struggles than older generations, with accelerated inflation rates, higher cost of living. Buying a house these days is becoming impossible. Plus, we also started our career similar to millennials, in a time very, very unstable political environment, with a pandemic also reshaping completely how workspaces looked like and what was expected from workers. So yeah, I think these are the most common stereotypes, and they're definitely harmful because, well, it's all stereotypes because they reduce the whole generation to just a couple of negative attributes.
Thanks a lot for sharing. I wonder as well if it is contextual, because I can see a lot of the stereotypes I hear about my generation reflected in, what Sarah said and also what Charlie has said. I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, depending on context, say, for example, if I go to a lot of emerging markets, like say Nigeria, for example, a country in Africa, a stereotype I hear quite often about millennials is that they are entitled, obsessed with tech, which is probably not wrong. There's this idea of a person who prioritizes work-life balance over the hustle culture, which at the same time that almost doesn't make sense, because I feel like a lot of us are still very much in that rat race and hustle culture because of the social economic landscape in which we engage in. But there's also this idea that we're driven by purpose and maybe almost out of touch with reality. So my parents' generation, they had to work, they had to put food on the table. They didn't have the luxury of purpose or the luxury of thinking about their mental health and their well-being. Whereas that's the perspective that they think, at least if I look at it from a Nigerian context, that I get from that perspective. Globally, one of the things I've heard about millennials is also about that we kill industries. So like cable TV, chain restaurants, traditional office culture. So of course, it brings forward the idea of what is a traditional office, culture. And of course, millennials have also been at the forefront of things like innovation, social change, and redefining workplace expectations. But then if you look at previous generations as well, from baby boomers to the others as well, they've also been at the forefront of change. So I wonder if there is that we all grapple with the same things, but we adapt it for the social and geopolitical context in which we engage in. So along those lines of thoughts, I have a question for the two of you. So if we look, say, at generational conflicts, the way they're playing out currently in society, what do you think it reveals of, say, deeper systemic issues or power within the world as we have it today? Charlie.
Yeah, wow, generational conflicts. Yeah, definitely they exist everywhere. And I think these assumptions that we were talking about, they do nothing but even fueling them and making them more polarized. I think these conflicts actually show a lot. They show a lot about how the time is changing. And obviously, because you mentioned it, everything's sort of contextual, I am bringing the perspective of someone who's from Europe and worked mainly in Europe in different countries. So this is I'm not speaking for all Gen Zers here, but this is my background. But I think, these conflicts also really bring to light structural issues of inequality, discrimination, and oppression that have always been there. So I think that's also what kind of unites different generations at the end of the day, like the same thing that's making them conflicting. Because there's actually this paper that I've been reading by Barbara Herrenreich from 2009. So it's something that's been like sort of talked about for a long time now. That how workers, when they express frustration or exhaustion in corporate culture, they're often dismissed as having negative attitude, which is also what happens often with Gen Zers here from older generations when they bring up that they don't accept the current working conditions. They're dismissed as having a bad mindset, but this actually just reinforces a culture of silence where questioning the system is reframed as a personal failure rather than a legitimate response to exploitation. And I think that's something that it's actually always been there. This exploitation is not something new. It's just the new generations have the words, the courage, the platforms to have their voices sort of heard on this kind of issues. So that's why the conflict arises, because there's different ways of addressing things that have always been there. I don't know if this makes a lot of sense.
Really great point. Thank you for sharing, Sarah.
I think when I think about this, I think about it a lot from the perspective of working on LGBTQ plus inclusion in workplaces. And again, I'm often talking about kind of European workplaces, and the legal and social situations that govern queer lives differ around the world. But we've seen so much change and so much progress in the last kind of 30 years on LGBTQ plus rights. And that has been hard fought and hard won, and we have people in our workplaces who remember not having the right to marry, who remember not having any protection from discrimination at work. And we have people in our workplaces who that's a given, and that's always been a given. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic because I see it often playing out in one of two ways. I think as this continued push for rights and changes in our workplaces, some people who've been fighting this for years see this space opening up as a beautiful, great thing and see them as kind of having sown the seeds for that space to open up, for people to ask for more, for people to gain more recognition, more rights in our workplaces. I do also see a bit of a worrying trend of like when we talk about like rights as pie, this idea that like rights are finite, and that if we continue to push for different things for different people, there won't be enough for other people. And that kind of like trying to kind of safeguard things that admittedly people have fought really, really hard for, but that comes often at the expense of kind of further progress and further kind of pushes for change within our workplaces. And I think that when people who have been trying to change their workplaces for a long time or trying to change society for a long time, as the queer community has, when people can work together and learn across generational divides, then that is a really powerful thing. But when those things start to come into conflict, when you hear narratives of like, there's too many words to describe people's identity nowadays, or people want too much from their workplaces, or people want special treatment, and all this nonsense that we're starting to hear, that can be really damaging because it causes friction within a community. And when we talk about power, we are seeing more and more LGBTQ plus people in positions of power in organizations. They often tend to be older. They often tend to have a slightly different worldview. And there is huge potential there to kind of keep that ladder kind of going down and help, create the workplaces you wish that you'd had. But that's sometimes also not the case. And people feel this fear because we are presented with the idea that our rights are finite, right? A lot of the time to stop us asking for more. People can end up swept into that and sort of pulling the ladder up behind them and saying, okay, we can have workplaces that work for queer people like me or LGBTQ plus people like me, but not other kinds of LGBTQ plus people who push the boundaries of what has been socially acceptable through their lives. And I think that can cause real kind of challenge, but also tells us a lot about how power flows in complex ways within marginalized and oppressed communities as well as between them.
Thanks for sharing. I'm reflecting on maybe this inherent human need to differentiate and to form a group. What you were saying about power also resonates in that I know even within groups. So for example, let's take, the fight for binary gender equality. So I'm talking here like men and women, and say like, oh, women, we don't have this opportunity. We don't have, pay equity. We don't have this or that. But oftentimes it also feels like work around that space and tends to center on what the dominant view of womanhood is. And by the time you bring in an intersectional lens in terms of looking at which women are being paid, even anything on the dollar, or which type of women are being referenced, then you see that. I think that's kind of the idea of like right as a pie, like we have limited space to share, so to say, and we don't have space for a lot of people. So when we start talking about women of color or disabled women or trans women, that slowly dissipates or quickly dissipates. And I see that conversation also happening across all the different generations. So in every generational group, as much as we can say we're the same and we're all millennials, we think like this, or we're all baby boomers, we think like that, even within those groups, there is a sense of lack of unity and, the need to form a pack and to get whatever biggest slice of the pie that we can get. And to that, I also want to ask a question about this narrative, especially from this linear binary narrative at best, where there is this idea that the younger generation will save us. So Gen Z, you have a lot of responsibility to save the world. So there's also this perspective around Gen Z being inherently more progressive than millennials, or millennials it being more progressive than the formers. So I guess my question is, do you think that this is true? And if not, why? Let's start with Charlie, Gen Z.
Yeah, I would love to start on this. I also just want to briefly make one comment on what Sarah was talking about how, you feel that like your rights are being taken away from you, or like there's less space for your rights if we see rights as a pie. But I think also one thing that maybe it's not talked about enough is how actually inclusion and accessibility benefits everyone at the end of the day. Like having an intersectional approach to discrimination, to oppression, will benefit everyone. So I think maybe rethinking and reframing it in that way, not something that, oh, if we give trans people rights, that only benefits trans people. That's not true. So I think that's maybe food for thought. But on the younger generations saving us, yes, I guess we will, because we will be on this earth for longer, but it does put an awful lot of pressure on us. And I think it also simultaneously allows older generations to sort of wash their hands off and feel like they don't also have a responsibility to drive change and correct the mistakes that they themselves have made in the past. So I think it's a very dangerous narrative to have. And about whether like we're more progressive, I wouldn't know if we're inherently more progressive. I do think that we have a much larger vocabulary to describe things that have always been there. Marginalized voices are being finally more amplified in like among like Gen Zers. Like for instance, take the example of queer people, though. Like never in history there have been this many people coming out as queer or trans or gay. But that's not because queer and trans people did not exist before. It's just because we have different means today that allow them not to be silenced as easily, that allow to create safe spaces, for instance, on the internet, seeing yourself represented, finding communities online. So I think that obviously helps this idea of thinking that younger generations are more progressive. But maybe we'll talk about it more later, but I also feel like there is an increase in the opposite side of the spectrum, as in like younger generations are getting also very radicalized on the least progressive side of the spectrum, let's say. So I wouldn't know if I would feel comfortable defining younger generations like inherently more progressive than millennials, for instance.
Thanks, Charlie. Sarah?
It winds me up, to be honest. Like, I find it quite an annoying oversimplification for all of the reasons that Charlie has shared, especially because I think it sometimes allows people to wash their hands of a situation, but also because I don't think that the data and the science necessarily backs the idea up, or certainly doesn't show us that it's quite as simple as that. And actually, I think, we're seeing people of all generations, but especially people's younger generations, turning towards more right wing and quite extreme right wing ideologies and politicians. And I think if we just sort of wash our hands of it and say the younger generation will save us, then that just won't result in the change that we want and need to see. And I don't really have loads to add to what Charlie's said, because I think that's exactly the point here, that it takes intergenerational conversations and working and learning across generations for social change to happen, not it being the responsibility of just one section of society and just one group of society.
Thanks for sharing. I have some days, especially in this 2025 that we're experiencing in the world, I'm not sure. I don't think that perspective is true. So I guess I'm also on the side that you are on, in terms of I find myself, because I have little children and they're Gen A's, and I find myself mostly terrified for them, to be honest. The world we're creating and the world we're building for them. I think that cycle of oppression and systemic challenges have a way of reproducing and recreating themselves. It seems, oftentimes people think about things like, what are we going to learn? When do we learn? It seems like we don't. It seems like it's a different type of spirit, different form. Or sorry, it's the same kind of spirit, a different form, where it's sometimes we see things happening that have happened before, that have been fought for before, but then we start from scratch. And I think, to your point, we see a lot of young people actually having very radical perspective, having very polarized perspective. So it leads to more polarization and fragmentation. So a lot of younger boys, for example, there's a huge discussion now happening in the world, around boys and men and the lack of attention that they get, which often amplifies this feeling of rejection. And then they seek some type of belonging elsewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of time in the digital world, where they're easily radicalized with perspectives that is both for their own detriment and also for the detriment of, say, women and girls. But we can also talk about it from the perspective of how young women are incredibly, in a digital world where they're forced to have one perspective of what it is to be successful or not. So I'm struggling with the idea that they will save us. I think that one of the things I could say, for example, for Gen Z is that Gen Z is shaking things up for sure. I think they are the most diverse, digitally fluent, and socially conscious generation yet. I don't think we can argue with that. I think that we see a lot of climate action prioritized by Gen Z. Gen Z also prioritizes, mental health, systemic changes. Also, they challenge a lot of outdated norms, and they demand, kind of like accountability from institutions. But what we see across elections, say in North America, in Europe, in parts of Africa, in Asia, is this is the general view. But then when we analyze data from how they vote, we see that they vote in a way that is sometimes quite right-wing, or against their own interest, or against the interest of other people around them. But I think as well that no generation can single-handedly save the world. It has to, since this is a systemic process, it has to be a collective effort, while Gen Z is pushing for change. Real progress really requires that intergenerational collaboration, the distribution of power, or the redistribution of power, and also sustained action beyond social media activism, because that's also what I find maybe sometimes a bit more frustrating is there's a lot that is happening on social media, but what about the work to be done? So this is where we need to leverage the collective knowledge of, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Zs, silent generation, so we can also leave or create a better world for Gen As when they actually have, when they start participating in the discourse. So that's kind of where I'm at, especially in this moment in history. But I do want to lean in on the radicalization, which you both talked on. We're seeing this rising level of radicalization. We're seeing misogyny. We're seeing transphobia. We're seeing racism. We're seeing ideologies that polarize people on, very extreme ends. And I guess the question I'd like to ask here is, how should we be responding from your perspective, in the workplace, in communities, as individuals? What should we be doing? And what do you think the older generation in the workplace should be doing in collaboration with your generations?
I don't know.
Charlie?
Is it fine if I answer first? I think this sparked a lot of thoughts in my head for sure. I think it's very interesting to talk about radicalization in younger generations. I think many Gen Zers feel hopeless and disillusioned about the future. And I think this sentiment often translates into general dissatisfaction with those in positions of power. So anyone that offers a different approach, something that's not been seen yet, something that's not the norm, even if it's radical, it instantly becomes more appealing to them, right? So obviously the use of social media is one thing, but there's also general lack of trust for like traditional political parties, for instance, if we talk about political elections. And I do want to, though, talk a bit about like the word radicalization, because I think the word radical often has a negative connotations because it's intended as like far right radicalism, and it's not just that. I think it depends on what you define as being radical. For me, for instance, it also means challenging structural inequalities and systems of oppression. So I don't think that this radicalization is always bad, like independently from the context in which we're seeing it. So like we also think about uh, like how actions of radical groups throughout history have been necessary to bring about true social change, right? So for instance, if we're talking about labor movement, like minimum wage, having trade unions was considered something super radical at the beginning, and now it's sort of the norm and something that we take for granted. So I just want to like also reflect a bit on that and like how we use the word radicalization. But to answer your question, how we should respond to this, I think first of all, like embracing that everything is a process. So this is somehow part of the process, right? Like it's these things that we're seeing, they're always just a symptom of a bigger problem. Why are young people radicalizing on one side or the other of the political spectrum? What does this mean? What have we done to cause that? What have older generations have done to cause that? So I don't have the answer on what we should do, but I think not just like dismissing it as something that it's all the internet's fault or social media fault, or like young people should spend less time on their phones. I don't think that's the approach, because I think it's a lot more deep and nuanced than that. So that's the contribution that I can give to this argument for now.
Thanks, Charlie. Sarah?
I think the phones and social media point's really interesting, right? Because I think there's often this like, oh, it's social media's fault. And I think often that is when we're seeing a generation of people who are learning about things in a different way, and a way that some people don't understand or don't have experience of. And I think that can create this like mystery around like what happens on social media. And I think that is my like number one point about workplaces, is like getting curious about like what is actually going on. So I would agree, like social media in and of itself, time on your phone is not the core and the crux of the problem, right? The crux of the problem is that social media is changing the way that we access and process information, sometimes for the better. If we look at being able to access news firsthand from different places in the world and not filtered through news organizations all the time, but coming straight from people's lived experience, that's really changing how we can see what is happening in our world, and maybe from a different perspective and a different point of view. But there are also kind of some very exploitative kind of approaches to social media that are attempting to radicalize people in different ways that we don't always kind of understand. I think that when we think about like how we can respond as workplaces, I think the biggest thing is like, as especially when we're kind of in any generation actually, is like decentering ourselves and decentering the idea that this conversation is about me and the way that I work and the things that I do, but instead kind of inviting that conversation and that challenge. I've definitely found sometimes some people that I manage who are younger and newer in the workplace, they've kind of refused to do something. And my initial response has been like, I can't believe you're just not going to do that. And then when you take a step and you take a breath and you're like, okay, what you're saying to me is like, being asked to do this or do this in this way doesn't work for me, or isn't reasonable, or doesn't fit with my boundaries in the workplace. That's a really reasonable thing that you want to accommodate, right? And you want to find a solution. You want to work in dialogue with someone to figure out how the workplace can work best for them. And I think that's always the point, right? Taking a breath, taking a step, taking it away from being about you and yourself, and thinking about the structures and the processes and the way our society is set up, actually usually not to the benefit of most people. It's not about you. And when you're able to kind of see that and get that distance, it helps you to take a more nuanced view of building a workplace that feels like it's for everybody.
Really interesting. Thanks for sharing. I'm looking at some of the comments on the chat, and there's something here from Henin about would one's very simple thing, people talking with each other, being approached, happens very little. And I guess I also want to speak to that, because I think we live in a time where you are almost pigeonholed to have a particular identity or belief system, where it seems almost impossible that we can hold two or multiple thoughts, no matter how conflicting or paradoxical they are, if they are true. So I guess what I mean by this is, I do agree that there is also that lack of, we are not talking to each other anymore. We're not hearing each other. Maybe we never did. I had a really interesting experience being in the US from January to February. And it was at the time where, the current president had taken office, and, Republicans and Democrats, they are very firmly on their own side and almost no middle ground. And it was interesting being in a space with them where they couldn't talk to each other because they just saw the other as an enemy of their progress. But for us as foreigners who came into that space to ask questions, they were so open to answering our questions, to listening to us, to also being challenged by us. So I think maybe there's space in terms of how do we collectively collaborate in the workplace, where we can see that there's so much we can also benefit from all the generations, right? Rather than seeing it as an either-or situation, I think there's a lot we can learn. I have to say that I sometimes also have that natural bias, which sometimes is my first thought, but I dust it out very quickly, where if I see someone from a younger generation, maybe a Gen Z, or honestly someone younger, even though they are a millennial, if they say, oh, I can't do that, or I'm exhausted, I keep thinking, where is the tenacity? Where is the toughness? Why can't you do what you're expected to do? And of course, that's when I take a step back and go, okay, what is here for me to learn? How can I engage differently? Because maybe they're trying to tell me something in a way that I'm not hearing them. I think I saw also in the chat that Kevin had left a comment around, in Norway, for example, a lot of young people, I read it earlier, but maybe are burnt out, or they feel like the current workplace does not work for them. And I know that in Norway, there are a significant amount of people on sick leave, on mental health breaks. And I don't think this is Norway alone. I think like this is a lot of the Western world. So it's like, what are we doing wrong? And how can we bridge that? Sarah, sorry, I don't know if Charlie wanted to say something.
Yeah, I did very quickly on this, because I mean, I don't hold the answers to everything that you just said. I think they're all very interesting points, but I think one aspect of it at least is the talking to each other, collaborating, like having earlier burnout and stress. Like, I think all of these are just like consequence of how well-being and happiness and self-care in the corporate world have been shaped to be solely connected to productivity, and how like self-care in organizational cultures is just like translated to our individual responsibility to like go home early, maybe, like live our little lives alone and like recharge to then just go back to work and keep doing the things that you were doing. So it's not like about being actually just happy or like taking care of yourself and changing the structures that cause these issues. But it's just connected to like seeing humans just as these machines of productivity that need to keep doing it for the hassle. So I think recognizing that could be a first step to also increase this communication between people and actually starting seeing like care in workplaces as something that's completely independent from the productivity that you have in that workplace and like your output in a way that you have in the job environment. So I just wanted to mention this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Completely agree. Sarah, we're coming up to the final questions here because we need to jump into Q&A. But quickly, a question for you. Based on your work at Stonewall with young LGBTQIA plus people, what are some of the biggest gaps between what, is expected or what they expect and need from the workplace and what the workplace is actually offering to them?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and I can't necessarily speak for everybody, but something I really noticed. So a lot of my work involves I'm like my background is like radical pedagogy and justice for like social education, justice kind of conversations. And a lot of my work involves going into workplaces and facilitating sessions around LGBTQ plus inclusion. But they kind of speak to exactly what you were saying, Chisom, about they're about creating a space where like a different kind of conversation can happen, where people can talk about things in a respectful way, but in a way that doesn't have to be right or get things right or kind of always understand, and can kind of be in more of an exploratory place. And I think that those spaces are so important, right? Because our whole workplace can't be that. A lot of the narratives that we are seeing right now, especially around trans people or misogyny or racism, are pretty horrible and pretty shit for people who are experiencing it. And those conversations are unpleasant to be a part of. But if we can create these other spaces that are specifically designed to be about that facilitated conversation and to be about how to explore and understand what is going on in the world without creating emotional labor for people who are experiencing it, think we can go a really long way. And I think that speaks to what young people want, what everyone wants, is to be respected in the workplace, even if we don't necessarily understand someone's identity, someone's experience, like having that base view of respect. And so many of these things are so simple, using people's pronouns correctly, making sure facilities are available for people to use, calling people by their name that they have told you is their name. And I think that when we can step out of always having to understand and move towards kindness and generosity and respect, I think it's not that simple, but I think that's a really important starting point in the workplace, moving away from things being always so political and radicalizing, but actually being about the spaces of respect. But I also think there are things that I'm seeing workplaces do that are really important. And one of the biggest ones is where people provide private healthcare provision for their employees, making sure they provide gender affirming care as part of that private healthcare. Most of our healthcare systems are not set up to easily provide gender affirming care to people, to trans people. And that is a huge thing that I think all workplaces who provide private healthcare can do to help people exist in the world and navigate really difficult systems. There's loads more, but that is my big one that I always say to people. In the UK, our gender affirming healthcare system has years long waiting lists. It's almost impossible to access for young people. It's becoming increasingly impossible to access. This is a really practical thing that people can do to change that experience on a day-to-day basis.
Hmm. Thanks a lot for sharing. I want to close out this part with just a quick take away from the two of you on what kind of leadership is required to navigate a multi-generational workforce. And I see there's maybe a question around it as well, or a comment around it in the comment section. Charlie, I'm going to start with you quickly, kind of an overview.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, there are different kinds of leaderships, and I think everyone can be leaders to an extent. But I think to navigate, like multi-generational workforce, I think it's really essential to identify what unites all of us, despite of the generation we come from. So, for instance, how we are all struggling with the same structural problems that require collective action. And like addressing it together in a way that we understand that it's not the fight of one generation, but something that at the end of the day is going to benefit everyone. I think that can be quite important. Not the only thing, but definitely a contributing thing.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, there's loads of kind of leadership, and I always think the most important kind is the kind that feels authentic to you. So maybe if I speak from the um, I try and lead in a way that is collaborative, in a way that works as much as possible by consensus, and a way that brings in and draws in and invites as many different perspectives as possible before we collectively decide how to proceed or what to do. That doesn't always work. It's not always possible in every working decision, but I try and keep that kind of collaboration, curiosity, relationship at the center of the way that I lead, and I see other people doing similar things with real success.
Thanks a lot for sharing. And if I can add to that, I think for me also in my own leadership practice, what I see works irrespective of who I'm talking to, their race, their gender, their generation, none of that really matters. It's really just about adaptive leadership, recognizing that people have different motivations, they have different communication styles, and they all have different approaches to work. And as leaders, we also need to adjust to fit that context. Some need mentoring, some need coaching, some people need, autonomy. Even within my workplace, I have some people, depending on the culture and the context that they come from, even when they are in the same in the same generation as others, they require different styles because it is informed also by their culture. I think inclusive and equity-centered leadership is important. So I think both of you have said creating space where all voices are valued, regardless of age, challenge biases. We need to continually challenge what we think of groups of people because of how they look, their age, or how they present. I think a leadership that also emphasizes psychological bravery. I have been a bit on the spiral on psychological safety because I think it's great, it's ideal, it's for the birds, but really we need to engage from a psychologically brave perspective, creating, situations or spaces where people can actually speak their mind and challenge norms that don't work. I think this intergenerational communication and conflict resolution is also quite important. So how do we continue to bridge gaps? I think both of you have shared. And of course, I think that whole purpose-driven and flexible leadership, which basically also focuses on, it's not about treating everyone the same. It's really about meeting people where they are, valuing the different perspectives that they bring, even when we don't understand it, because we don't know what we don't know. And of course, fostering a culture of continuous learning and mutual respect. So that's kind of just like how I think about, it's a lot of work, but leadership needs to be adaptable to different situations. Okay, I'm looking here quickly at some of the questions. I think we might have touched on some of them. But there's a question here from somebody who works in a non-profit space, I think. And they had said that they are working with let me see, people from all generations. I wonder if you have perspective on how best to engage, take care of Gen Z in a volunteer setting. Sorry, Charlie, how do you want to take this one? Because it's directed specifically
I
at
can
you.
definitely take this one.
Okay.
I have a lot of thoughts. Okay, volunteering. First of all, I'm assuming you mean by volunteering like unpaid work, because that's what it is most of the time, right? Which can be for like a noble cause, and like people might want to dedicate their time to that, and I obviously respect it, and I do them myself. But I think if you want to actively include and make sure it's like a good, safe space for everyone, I think recognize who has the privilege to be doing that in that moment. Who has the privilege to spend time and energy on something that does not give them money, which is a concept that I hate. But unfortunately, we're living in a world where the cost of life is just on the rise and it's not stopping. So recognizing who is there and has the privilege to be there, as well as like trying to making it more inclusive for the people that maybe cannot do that. So like if you can put some sort of financial compensation to that, like I don't know, reimbursing travel expenses, or like not making it so that people actually have to like pay to be doing work for free, then it can allow people to actually, you know, spend their time and energy on whatever thing that you're asking them to volunteer on meaningfully, because they don't have to worry about the financial implications of that. And I mean, and then like I guess the same things like beyond the financial things, then everything else I think is the same thing that apply to normal workplaces of like the things of inclusion and diversity that we already been talking about. But I think especially when it comes to volunteering, recognizing that you're asking people to dedicate their time for free just because they're young, that doesn't mean it's okay. But I recognize the value of volunteering. Just acknowledge who can afford to do that and try and give some sort of compensations in other ways, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. I see a question here or a comment here from Kevin, which I will take on. It says, hope you soon address the generational elephants in the room, including this room. So elders, and then he dropped the link, UN Equality Reports, ageism, discrimination more than sexism and racism. I think it really depends on context, but let me first address this room. We've taken on this conversation before in each year, at least once, we engage with intergenerational more than once. You know, we do it on the sessions and we also do it on our summits. And actually, this is the first time we really have young people. Normally, we always put forward perspective of the older generation because oftentimes they are the leaders, they are the decision makers at the workplace. And I think what we also see in our work, I think if you look at work from gender equality, or if you look at work from even like climate sustainability, oftentimes it's the older generation making decisions that impact younger people, and we hardly ever get to center their voices in the conversation. So this was a calculated intention by us to also center younger voices. I think Charlie is probably the youngest person we've had in any of our conversations. And I'm not saying that with pride. I'm also saying that with an act of, I am also responsible in a sense to highlight all voices, not just older voices, which is what we have historically done. Now, that said, I do think as well that it depends on context. So this UN report that you highlight, it's absolutely true. And I think from a Western context, perhaps, but I think in a lot of countries across the world, say in emerging markets, and honestly, quite also in Norway, there are rooms for which like young people don't even get a say because there's ageism, but it's both ways. That's the whole thing about bias. On one hand, you can look at someone who's older and, you know, you think of them as, you know, they're elders. What do they have to contribute to this conversation for which they have so much knowledge and wisdom to share because they've been here longer? But at the same time, I think oftentimes we don't always see younger people beyond like millennials, like myself, in the room to have conversation. So I think it's not an either or. It's how do we continue to create spaces where we lift different voices. One of the things we can also do is to drop the link afterwards for all the other sessions. I think Michael Watson, who's already on this conversation as well, has previously joined a conversation we had on intergenerational diversity. So it's really important for us to bring forth all the different perspectives. Hi, Michael. Good to see you. Yeah. So, Kevin, I hope that answers your question, but it's a work in progress, you know, and I think also to Charlie's point is how do we continue to engage age, a generation that we have a lot of opinions for, but we don't really create, atmosphere that includes them in decision making or discussions. Okay, any other points here? Let's see. But anything else coming up for you? I hope we have 3 more minutes. I think, yeah, I'm gonna create space. Anything coming up for you right now, Sarah and Charlie, before I continue and round up?
I think my final thought on this is what I've really appreciated about this conversation is like the level of nuance that needs to be brought to conversations on age and ageism and generations. I think I can never work out what the right age in a workplace to be is, because it seems like you're either too young and then you're too old, and that doesn't seem to be a good age. So ageism is going to affect all of us in different ways, and that's often intersected by other identities that we might hold. I know personally, as a young woman in quite a senior position, like ageism affects me on a daily basis, and it affects us all. It affects us all differently. And I think what's most important to me is that we continue to bring that nuance to this conversation, because age and generational kind of experience in the workplace work really in many different ways, but it's also quite a new conversation that we're having. I've really noticed in the past few years, we've had so many more conversations around generational differences in our workplaces. And so it's an evolving conversation. And I know that's sometimes an uncomfortable place to sit because there aren't answers and there are not simple things we can do. But I think sitting in that nuance and complexity and thinking things through and being open to those conversations is so important.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Charlie?
Yeah, I guess my final thing would be also just to say generally, like, no matter all these differences, because of generation, like, or other aspects of our identities, like, I think I would just advise everyone to approach others with care, and also to start centering more like collective action and like this sense of community, and instead of focusing on individual and like individualistic practices, which I know, like, as living in Norway, I know that it's more difficult in certain countries compared to others. But I think, yeah, like care and community, I think, are just like so fundamental in any sort of conversations about workplace dynamics and also societal dynamics in general. So that's just the last thing that I wanted to add.
Thank you both for sharing. I think, yeah, culturally sensitive care, collective care, I think is so important, and holistic approach to all of this. One of the things I've learned is that you can learn from anyone. I learned so much from my 5-year-old. Of course, I'm biased. I think she's the smartest person in the world, but she challenges me constantly. And, so I'm just like, if I can learn from her, I can learn from anybody. And I think sometimes we take that for granted, that, oh, what do you know? How long have you lived in the world? Or we look at someone who's an elder and go, oh gosh, you're so outdated. And I think just having that humility and the curiosity to how we approach each person, and how we also understand that we can learn something from everyone we meet, goes a long way. So I really want to thank you both for your time, being here with us, sharing. I am committed. I know Charlie from before as well, to also lifting more, younger voices in the conversations that we have and in the events that we put together. That is a commitment I've made for this year. So I want to say thank you to all of you. Sarah, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your perspectives. I appreciate you, and everyone in this room, all the comments, really, really great insights as well. So thank you all. I appreciate you, and yeah, have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.